All right, welcome to this foreword for what is a very exciting and special moment and time for me, because we're about to get started on a gameplay or on a game which is I've personally been waiting for it for over 2 decades, and that is the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, this game is a very important game, both for myself, but also for gaming history and for Squaresoft, now Square Enix, the company who made it. It is easily one of my favorite games of all time, as you can kind of tell by having Cloud and Sephiroth here on my desk where I work and do all of my video editing and everything like that. So, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit in advance before we got right into it, and hopefully give you a bit of insight as to why this is such a special game. Now, to do that, I first want to talk about my gaming history, and then I want to talk about the game, the original game itself, and then I want to talk about the remake and why, and what I know about it. So Final Fantasy VII, the original Final Fantasy VII for the original PlayStation, was the very first console game that I ever owned myself. Gaming history-wise, my Baba and Jido, which is Ukrainian for grandmother and grandfather, had a Nintendo Entertainment System, an original NES, which was, they had it specifically for myself and my brother. And when we were there, they had sort of two actual full games and something else, which I'll get to in a little bit. We had Super Mario Brothers, the original, and Duck Hunt. The third thing they had was a knockoff cartridge that they got from one time they were traveling somewhere in Asia, I don't remember where, and it had like 100 games in it, but each game was like a level of Galaga or something like that. And that was the first console in my family. Other games that were played in my family when I was a child was we had a Macintosh 2 and later a Power Macintosh, on which my family was big fans of the Sierra Online games, specifically King's Quest and Space Quest. We also had Police Quest, but we didn't really play that much at all. I remember back in the days of I think Space Quest 3 was my favorite, the Pirates of Pestulon. And King's Quest 5, Absence Makes the Heart Go Yonder, I believe, is the titles of those 2 games. Now, we kind of played them, but I was so young, I didn't really understand the full extent of what was going on. Sometimes when they even used Old Gothic fonts in the King's Quest series, I couldn't even read them. So I often played with my parents, who would sometimes solve the puzzles for me or help figure things along. I was mostly just intrigued by the idea of the interactivity of it, the pretty colors, pretty pictures, things like that. I didn't really understand the story or what was really going on. Obviously that kind of grew and changed as I myself grew and changed and developed. The next generation of consoles, the Super Nintendo generation, completely passed my family by. I had to play Super Nintendo games and experience the Super Nintendo through friends who had the console. Again, mostly it was things like I liked the pretty colors. At that point, I kind of understood how the stories worked and that there was a story and a progression and everything like that, but I never really got into any major story-driven game because A, those consoles weren't mine. I was playing on a friend's console at their own house, and sometimes I couldn't save because there were only 3 save slots and they were taken up by my friend and their siblings or something like that. Now, when I was in grade 7, starting junior high here, my parents got my brother and I a PlayStation, an original PlayStation for Christmas. And alongside the original PlayStation, I got Final Fantasy VII while my brother got NASCAR, 98, I believe. So I think really this was arguably the first game that I ever owned myself. That wasn't a family-owned game, it was my game. Though maybe possibly one competitor. When I got my original Bondi Blue iMac back around about the same time, around about 97, 98, it came with a little booklet of CDs that had demo programs, or in some cases full programs, available for you to use on the new iMac. One of those demo discs, or no, this was actually a full game, was a game called MDK, which was absolutely hilarious when you get right down to it, because MDK stands for Murder, Death, Kill, which is not the kind of title that you'd expect a company like Apple to include with their products. That's kind of not in line with their corporate image. But yeah, I can't really remember which one came first, whether I had the iMac first, which came with MDK, or whether we had the PlayStation first, which I was also given Final Fantasy VII. So it was a very, very special game to me because it was the first game that was my game. It was the first game that I really got into that was my own game. Also, being at that age, I now really began to appreciate the storytelling aspects of the game a lot more than I had in games prior. Now, what about the importance of the game to Squaresoft at the time, which later went on to become what we now know as Square Enix? Before I get into Final Fantasy VII, just a little bit of history into the franchise itself. A common thing that a lot of people like to joke about is, well, why is it called Final Fantasy if there's 7 of them, and now 15? And the reason for that is, back in the day, mid to late 80s, I want to say, I'm not entirely sure on the date, Squaresoft was a game development company that was going bankrupt, basically. They had not really had much in the way of success. And one of their employees was a man by the name of Hironobu Sakaguchi, who was, up until that point, a relatively failed game designer and game developer. None of his games that he had conceived or created had really taken off or been successful. So, given that Hironobu Sakaguchi was not really seeing much in the way of success, and Squaresoft was in the process of going bankrupt, they kind of weighed their options, and they kind of said, well, you know what? We could develop a few different projects. Most game development studios have multiple projects going on at one time, but they would all be relatively mediocre just simply from a lack of resources. Or they could pool all of their existing resources into one Final Fantasy. And that's where the name comes from, is it was the final thing the company would ever do if it didn't succeed. And Hironobu Sakaguchi, I believe, was planning on quitting the game development industry if this didn't work. It was a last gasp, a last try for both him and the company to make it work. Obviously, it was a success, and they went on to make much more and have become one of the biggest gaming companies in the world. They both develop their own games, as well as they are now one of the largest publishers of games in the world, right up there with EA, Ubisoft, Activision, all kinds of other companies of those caliber. Final Fantasy obviously didn't stop there with rescuing the company. Hironobu Sakaguchi and Squaresoft continued to make Final Fantasy titles, each one having many of the same themes, and eventually you got some recurring things like chocobos. There's always a character named Sid, things like that. And not all of them made their way to North America originally, which is why you may see some of the older titles from the Nintendo and Super Nintendo era referred to by 2 different numbers. For example, Final Fantasy VI, the 6th game that Squaresoft had made, was only the 3rd game to be brought over to North America, which is why it was originally called Final Fantasy III. They've since gone back and rebranded them with the proper names, and they have actually released some of the games which never came to North America originally in the subsequent years. But In North America, we got Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 7. And in Japan, they got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The reason North America jumped from 3 to 7 is when 7 came out, they decided to bring the naming for both regions in line, so they would both be Final Fantasy VII. That wasn't the only change that happened with Final Fantasy VII either. Final Fantasy had previously, up until that point, only been developed for Nintendo consoles. However, Final Fantasy VII was going to be made for Sony's new PlayStation console, and not for any Nintendo console at the time. Now, there were a few reasons for this. One of them was that the games industry as a whole was making the transition from 2D games to 3D games, and 3D games and 3D graphics obviously take a lot more space than 2D graphics do. While Nintendo was sticking with console-based cartridges in their Nintendo 64, Sony was using this newfangled technology called CDs in their PlayStation. CDs could hold a heck of a lot more data than a Nintendo 64 cartridge could. So Squaresoft saw that as an advantage when developing what was going to be one of their newest, greatest games. And even with that, it was one of the first games ever to be released across multiple discs, not just one single disc. It actually spanned 3 discs, which was relatively unheard of at the time. It wasn't the first, I don't think, but it was one of the first. So that, combined with the fact that the PlayStation used memory cards to store save files instead of storing them on the cartridge like the Nintendo 64 did, meant that you could have one save file carry through on a game from one disc to the next, whereas on the Nintendo 64 you couldn't ever have a multi-cartridge game because your save file would be stuck on the one cartridge and you wouldn't be able to migrate it from one cartridge to the next cartridge. Fun technical fact about the switch from 2D to 3D, obviously 3D graphics are a lot more data and take a lot more processing power to make happen. The longtime series composer is a man by the name of Nobuo Uematsu, and Uematsu was given the choice for Final Fantasy VII. Given that they were putting the game on CDs, he was given the opportunity to put CD quality audio in Final Fantasy VII. However, he chose not to. He chose to go with MIDI-based compositions for Final Fantasy VII, explicitly for the purpose of giving the graphics team more processing power to work with. See, the trouble with CD quality audio is that you have to load it completely before it can play, which takes processing power away from the ability of the game to render an image. Whereas MIDI is rendered on the fly. Basically, it's like giving the console sheet music, which the console then plays as it goes. It takes a lot less data to load a MIDI file than it did to load the other formats that were available at the time. So Nobuo Uematsu deliberately put himself at a handicap for the specific purpose of making the game as a whole better and giving more processing power to the graphics teams. The one exception, if I recall correctly, is One Winged Angel, the very famous, epic final battle music from the end of the game. That one, I believe he did go for full CD quality music on. Now, there were a couple other change-ups in the creative team that went into Final Fantasy VII as well. Longtime concept artist and character designer Yoshitake Amano had decided that he was going to leave Japan and move to New York around about the time that they were going to be developing Final Fantasy VII. Yoshitake Amano, by the way, is an amazing artist. If you have a chance to check out his work, please do so. It is very distinct, it is very unique. One of my friends describes it as, if all the characters look like anorexic elves, then it's probably Yoshitake Amano, which is kinda true, but it is very much so his distinctive style. Some beautiful watercolor work in his paintings and illustrations. Highly recommend checking out his work if you are in any way interested in art. So, without a concept artist or character designer, they asked a man by the name of Tetsuya Nomura to step up into that role. Tetsuya Nomura had been a graphics programmer with the Final Fantasy team since the Final Fantasy III era. That is, Japanese Final Fantasy III, not American Final Fantasy III, for clarity's sake. Tetsuya Nomura ended up becoming a little bit of a golden boy for Squaresoft. He would later go on to do the character designs for Final Fantasy VIII and X. He would conceive, direct, and just make happen the absolutely insane idea that is Kingdom Hearts, a collaboration between Squaresoft and Disney. That is, before it happened, people would have told you it's not possible because two giant companies with very different approaches to very different media types collaborating on a project was unthinkable. But he made it work. He also did a bunch of artwork and character designs for other lesser-known Squaresoft properties, such as The Bouncer, which is a very little-known PS2 era title that they did. And Final Fantasy XV, or what ended up becoming Final Fantasy XV, was developed from a project of his. When he was working on it, it was known as Final Fantasy VII, which was part of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, which was a bit of a weird organizational mess, if I'm perfectly honest. But he had the idea for Final Fantasy Versus 13. He was developing it, he did the character designs for it, he was directing it, and he was working on it for about 7 or 8 years and that is simultaneously alongside developing Kingdom Hearts 2 and Kingdom Hearts 3. Oh, and he also directed the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children movie, which was the second full-length movie that Square ever made. Eventually, Square took Tetsuya Nomura off of Final Fantasy Versus 13 and gave it to Tabata-san to develop into what would eventually become Final Fantasy 15, and there are great, vast differences between Nomura's original design and plan and what Tabata eventually came out with. But with so much on his plate, I guess it makes sense that they wanted Tetsuya Nomura to really focus on a few select projects. One other really important and notable contribution that Tetsuya Nomura had to Final Fantasy VII was in the development of the story. Up until this point, series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi had conceived and written the story overview for every single game up until that point, and been an executive producer in leading to the game's creation. So every story from Final Fantasy I to Final Fantasy VI was primarily the result of Hironobu Sakaguchi's mind. Unfortunately, when it came time to start developing Final Fantasy VII, Sakaguchi's mother passed away. Now, that's hard for anybody, but Japanese culture puts a very strong emphasis on family and family connections. And so Sakaguchi was in absolutely no state to lead the conception of the story of what would become Final Fantasy VII. In steps Tetsuya Nomura, who, in addition to doing the character designs and concept art, worked with Hironobu Sakaguchi to create the story concept, the story idea. From the story that was conceived by Sakaguchi and Nomura, they then handed it to the writers of Kazushige Nojima and Yoshinori Kitase. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing any of these names. I am not a Japanese speaker, obviously. And they took the story which had been conceived by Hironobu Sakaguchi and Tetsuya Nomura and took it the rest of the way into the story we all ended up experiencing when it actually came out. Yoshinori Kitase is also the game's director, so in addition to taking the story that was conceived of by Sakaguchi and Nomura and turning it into the final written product, he oversaw the development of the game as a whole. Now, one thing I'm going to say here, for those who have played the game or are familiar with the game's story, if you haven't and you want to go into it blind, spoiler-free, I'm just going to put a timestamp here at the bottom of the screen. Skip to that point to avoid the spoilers. I'm going to start pretty soon here. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Obviously, the death of Hironobu Sakaguchi's mother was a major inspiring influence to the themes and plot points of the game. I'm sure I don't have to tell you what point in particular. It is a very famous, very well-known, very heart-wrenching scene, which is one of those scenes that even now, 20 some odd years later, can still stir such strong emotions in me. And welcome back to those of you who skipped that part of the video. Tetsuya Nomura would also be a major contributor to the story of Final Fantasy X, after which he kind of stepped away from the Final Fantasy series games for a while to focus on things like Kingdom Hearts, the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children movie, things like that. The Final Fantasy VII Remake is actually very, very remarkable in that many of the executive creative team who worked on the original game have actually returned to work on the remake. Tetsuya Nomura is directing the game. Nobuo Uematsu, who has since left Square many years ago, but works with them frequently as an independent consultant and contractor, has returned to do the soundtrack for this game. Yoshinori Katase has returned as a producer on this game. And that's actually honestly quite remarkable because the video game industry sees a lot of movement. People leave game developers and join other ones. They move from one company to another. It's extremely rare that you see an individual person stay with one company for a very long time, unless they are in a kind of auteur position where they oversee major projects from start to finish for that company. Interestingly enough, before I go too much further onto this, Squaresoft's titles had typically done very well outside of the Japanese market, but not so well in Japan themselves compared to other major companies in their industry. The notable one in particular, which I'm referring to, is a company called Enix. Enix was responsible for creating the Dragon Quest series, which was kind of a competitor to Square's Final Fantasy. Eventually, Squaresoft and Enix decided to merge together into one company called Square Enix, which is the company and the entity that we know today, which is an absolute juggernaut in the industry. Now, one of the reasons why I brought up how important it was that we've got so many of these original creative minds returning to this project is what they've decided to do is not a shot-for-shot, like-for-like recreation. It's not a replica of the original Final Fantasy VII. What it is these minds that created the original piece of art got together and said, okay, now we have the power of this absolute massive company and the resources and the funds that Square Enix can bring to a project, as well as they've all now got over 20 years more experience and knowledge making games, and the technology has come so much farther than it was back in 97, 98 when it first came out. What they've done is they've said, if we were making the game for the first time today, how would we make it? And that's what we're going to get to experience. It's going to follow much of the same story, but they're going to flesh out things that they couldn't when they originally made the game, either due to a lack of funds, a lack of resources, or a lack of time. Obviously, the graphics are going to be a lot better. The game systems, the game play is much more modern, it's much more up to date, and it's running on current consoles instead of the original PlayStation. Now, that might be a cause for concern for many players because Final Fantasy VII is a very, very beloved game. It is one of the top-rated games by many people all over the world, and any change to that is potentially seen as a bit of a threat to the experience or to the memory. So one of the things that I've heard, and one of the things that they've talked about when I've seen interviews with the creators and things like that, is that they tried to bring a blend of the old style game mechanics and modern game mechanics in a way that seamlessly works them together and doesn't feel too old, but also doesn't feel like it's not respecting the heritage of the title. Now, I've watched a few videos on YouTube and things like that of people playing the game and talking about these changes, and it seems very, very promising. Square did put out a demo of this game, but I have personally chosen not to play it. I want to go into the game pure, as it were. I want to experience it for the first time in its full, complete state. I don't want to be going through the first few parts of the game as if I'm just going through the motions, as if I'm just doing the routine. I want to see the surprising new developments as they come up for the very first time. I want to learn the game mechanics as the game unfolds. I want to see the changes that they've made as they happen for the first time ever. As I said, Final Fantasy VII is easily one of my favorite games of all time. It was the first game which I really got to appreciate the storytelling aspect and the storytelling potential that games had. And even though there's been many amazing, amazing games since then, such as Mass Effect, you see my FemShep statue right here, Final Fantasy VII still holds up as one of the highest bars that any game can hope to live up to, in my experience. It was just so incredibly masterful, so incredibly groundbreaking, so incredibly well done that very few games have lived up to its reputation. I mean, I don't think I'm overselling it here. If you want a true testament of just how good and how beloved this game was, look at the fact that Square has seen fit to completely remake it from scratch more than 20 years later. Not many games ever experience that kind of attention. One thing which I think very much so points to the level of love that people who enjoy this game have for it is the opening dedication to the spin-off movie Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. The game opens with a title card that reads, "To those who love this world and new friendly company therein, this reunion is for you." So, I know this is a little bit long-winded, that's why I decided to spin it off into its own separate video before actually getting into the game itself. This has hit at an interesting time. Launch day for the Final Fantasy VII Remake is actually going to be the day that episode 111 of my The Witcher 3 playthrough publishes. And as I said, I've been waiting for this game for over 2 decades. I am super excited for it. I am going to be jumping into it head first and probably loving every second of it. So what I've decided to do is I've actually decided to release the gameplay videos of Final Fantasy VII concurrently with my playthrough of The Witcher 3. What you'll do is you'll see The Witcher 3 episodes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Final Fantasy VII Remake episodes on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, for as long as I can maintain that production schedule, because that's a lot of work on my part. I kind of think I'm a little bit insane for doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to get an episode with Final Fantasy VII Remake playthrough up as quick as I can, and I'm going to hopefully take you on the journey that I am so excited to return to, and I hope you'll join me as we go, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I hope to. So I'll see you there.